We are in Exodus, and we are in chapter 2 today. So if you have your Bible, I'm going to invite you to turn to Exodus chapter 2. And today, what we're going to look at is a story about the birth of Moses, the man who actually wrote this book and Genesis and then the 3 books after it. Any one of you who've had this experience, that you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to try to put words to it, but there's something about the birth of your child that is just beyond words, right? There's something about that moment when your newborn child is in your arms for the first time. It is an experience that is impossible to fully, deeply express, and many people have tried to, but that privilege doesn't die away after, that first day of their life. There are challenges and worried and sleepless nights for sure, but the privilege of being a parent to this treasure that you hold, it just hits you over and over again in the days and years to come. And being a parent is a precious thing, and we love the blessing that God pours out on us. However, waiting to become a parent, if you in that those months of expectancy, and especially your first child, you are kind of wondering what all the hubbub is about and if you're up to it or not. I don't know if you can flash back to that moment about the uncertainty of parenting is coming. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm hoping I'll be a good parent. I'm hoping that I'm ready. I want a chance to show that I'll be good at that. And your first chance to show that, especially as a dad, I can speak from the perspective of a dad. My first chance to show that I was up to the task was in the delivery room. It was not a great start in the delivery room for me. It's like, I'm going to be a great dad. I'm going to be the best dad. And I couldn't even stay on my feet in the delivery room. I remember, as Kylie's being born, I am so not good with hospitals and, people who are, it just kind of like gets me. I don't know why. It kind of wilts me. I don't know how to explain it, but, we're there in the delivery room and we're in the moments before Kylie is born, and the doctor looks over at me and says, I think you may need to take a seat. It's like, you know what? I think that's a good idea. And I went and sat down for a minute. But then when Kara was being born, I was like, you know what? My experience, I'm going to leverage all this. I'm going to step up into this moment in a really big way. And I found myself again in a cold sweat, white as a ghost. I wasn't really, really good about it. As a matter of fact, the doctor said, Dad, would you like to cut the cord? And I was like, absolutely not. I think I will leave that. You were trained for that, right? You're the professional. I want it done right, so I'm just going to leave that to you. But here's the thing about having children. Here's the thing about it. If someone came to you without actually telling you what it was all about, but they started to describe the experience of giving birth, they described for you only that experience, how much pain there is, and how much uncertainty, and how long it is, and how many things can go wrong, who would ever have children? If all they did was explain to you the trauma and the trial and the hurt that is involved with giving birth, everybody would be like, absolutely not. I want no part of that. The stories of long labor and extreme pain, the process itself, isolated from what comes from it, is not desirable. As a matter of fact, most people avoid situations with much less pain. Many people live in fear of pain that is much less than that, day in and day out. And they run from it, and they guard against it, even though it hasn't come. They run from pain. But people have babies all the time. And here's why. Because the focus isn't on the very real and intense pain. It is on where that pain leads. The payoff of the pain from birth is so much bigger than the price of the pain. And that story, that picture, that illustration is used many times in the Word of God to teach us about how we should live in this world. No matter how easy it is to understand with having kids, it's like, I understand that when I have a child, there's pain, but the pain will be so worth it, I won't even so much remember the pain because I'll be so glad for the joy. I understand that with having kids, but it seems impossibly hard to hold on to that idea in the struggles and pains of our life. Maybe it's because we don't believe that the payoff will be so much better than the pain. Maybe it's because we just get our focus fixed right here and now. And so our prayer life becomes about, God save me, God help me. But we don't realize how low we are aiming with our Heavenly Father. When all we ask is for God to take away our pain because it hurts, for God to remove the struggle because it's hard, for God to make everything good and pleasant and comfortable. When that starts to dominate our prayer life, it starts to set our minds and our hearts in a direction that discourages us and sets us up as vulnerable to throw in the towel when life doesn't go in a way that I can make sound good. We stop believing some of the things that we know. If we could realize how the Lord is using our pain for immeasurable good, I think, believers, we would have an entirely different mindset day in and day out. And that's what this story about Moses is given to teach us. Not just us, the Israelites, but by extension, thousands of years later here, us as well. And the lesson is that God is constantly at work on a much larger payoff than you have even imagined. Moses' parents in the story experience plenty of uncertainty, danger, worry, stress, all kinds of things that we can very readily identify with. And so you can imagine, as they are going on this journey, them crying out to God to save them, to relieve them from this struggle and this pain. And God does not criticize them. In other words, if all you are, and this is not about a criticism, like if all you are in your prayer life with God is like, God, this is too heavy, this is too hard, I can't take it anymore, God is not like scolding you through this. But He is inviting you to more than that. He's inviting you to see better, to see bigger, to see more than just that. God is working to do so much better than what we are hoping for. Let that, if you don't hear, if you fall asleep now and sleep through the rest of my message, let that grab a hold of you. God is doing more than you can imagine. He is doing better than you could even dream up. And He's doing it in the life of every single person who's putting their trust in Him. I hope today we can embrace this lesson for our own trials. That it's fine to ask God to save us, but what we need to have is this unshakable hope that He will do more than we can see from here. And so, Exodus chapter 2, we'll start at verse 1. We're actually going to go to verse 10 eventually, but we're just going to start with verses 1 and 2. And it says this: Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. This is the backstory to Moses' life. This is Moses, his family, and the time that he is born. The backstory of it is what we talked about last week. And if you weren't here last week, babies were not, especially baby boys, were not legal for them to live. In other words, Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, had put out a decree that when a Hebrew baby boy was born, they should be put to death. And when that didn't happen, when the midwives refused, he put out a general rule to all of his people, to all Egyptians: if you ever see a baby Hebrew boy, take them and throw them into the Nile River. Can you imagine the culture? He was threatened. We looked at it last week. He was threatened by Israel growing in numbers and whatever. And so he decided he was going to try to do population control. And so he came to this unthinkable idea that kind of deputized all of his nation and said to them, if you see a Hebrew boy, a baby Hebrew boy, throw them into the Nile so that they will die. And this is the backstory of Moses. It is the story of a man who eventually leads them out of slavery. And even though at this point in the story, he hasn't described it or told us any of that, it is still the first readers of the story were the Israelites who had been out of Egypt and on their way to Israel. So they knew where this was going. Just like we know where it's going, they knew where it's going. And so as Moses writes this, and as we talk about this, we want to talk about it in that larger context. We know where this is going. Some of the lessons that we're supposed to take from this come from the fact that we know where this is all going. And so the Passover and the Exodus being central parts of their national identity feeds into this. So it starts off with there is a man and a woman. No names, just nameless people. And they are from the tribe of Levi. Regular people caught up in this life of oppression and hate and slavery. We see how awful oppression is, how awful hate is in our world today. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that, and I'm sure you probably have, it is a terrible experience when it's institutionalized from a government or from a whole society system. It is more than we can probably imagine ourselves. And here are these two folks that are just normal Hebrew people from the tribe of Levi. Before we move on, being from the tribe of Levi was nothing at this point, but it was about to be something. And here's the thing about that. Moses includes that detail because what he's saying to us is God knows what's coming. God knows what he's going to do and give in the law. And so God already, when this baby is born, is preparing him, giving him the perfect heritage for the calling that he's going to bring in his life. Mom and dad here are just like, well, we're just Israelites. We're just from the tribe of Levi. That doesn't mean anything except that our baby is probably in danger of being killed. That's all they think that it means. They can't see. They have no concept of knowing that 100 years from now, being from the tribe of Levi is specifically the group of people God calls to be his representatives on earth. And that Moses, being from the tribe of Levi, and his brother Aaron, being from the tribe of Levi, will be the first people who represent the fact that the tribe of Levi is the representative tribe for God in Israel. And so as we read just verse 1, we start to recognize something that Moses is telling us. Even though Moses' parents had no idea what was up, God knew what was up. And God was doing what it took to prepare for what he was going to do that was bigger than what they thought. And so in verse 2, we see that she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son. Later we find out that they already have some other children. That Moses is not their only child. He has an older brother named Aaron. He has an older sister, probably older than Aaron, that is named Miriam. And so he has at least two siblings that we read about through the rest of the story of Moses. Having a son, as I started off talking about, huge blessing. What a tremendous blessing to have a child. Just a baby. What a gift from God. It is priceless. How much could you pay for the gift? I'm not talking about through adoption or something. I'm just saying, if you were like, I would like to have a baby, how much do you pay that a baby shows up in your hand? It's not something we can do. It's a blessing that God gives because God, the creator and the sustainer of life and the giver of life, gives life again and again. And it says that she sees him as a fine child. That's been a struggle for people to understand. What does this mean that she's a fine child? The best we can do with the Hebrew there is say, basically, that when she saw him, she loved him desperately and wanted no parts of him being a victim. She wanted to keep him alive. And so they had raised two children, but this child's different. Everything that they knew, we're experienced parents, you know. Our parenting experience of number 4 was a little different than our parenting experience of number 1. Parents, you know what I'm talking about? It's like number 1 was everything was wiped off, and, we had a GPS tracker on her at all times. We knew what she was doing, what her heart rate was, and all, you know what I mean? And number 4 was like every hour or so we would check in. Is he still alive? He seems to be okay. We're good. So because you start to get this impression that we know what we're doing. We know what matters and we know what doesn't. We can lean into our experience. Except child number 3, at least here, nothing about his story is anything like anybody else's story. Suddenly, all of their abilities as parents are kind of thrown out the window, and they are faced with a situation where they are starting over. When you're in those situations and you're like, man, I am too old for this. I shouldn't be facing this again. I shouldn't be back at square one again. It is frustrating to us. It is hard for us to navigate that stuff when experience and strength is nothing. When we are starting with the blank page again. But it's important to hear what Moses is telling us in the story. That when we face that moment where all of our skill and all of our experience and all of our understanding and all of our knowledge means nothing and we're starting over again, it is God's invitation for us to put our hope in Him again. That His plan is greater than us kind of having control or figuring it out or knowing what to do. His plan is so big that it requires us to be challenged to trust Him afresh and anew. And so here's baby number 3. We don't know what to do about this baby. We don't want him to die. So what do? She hides him for 3 months. But verse 3 and 4 pick it up from there. It says this. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. She could hide him no longer. She hid him for 3 months, but then it was like he's getting a little bit louder and the danger is just overwhelming. And so there's this experience that says, I've got to do something. There is this constant thought of danger, danger. Today could be the day that someone hears him cry. Someone shows up to take my baby and throw him into the Nile River. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? But I believe what Moses is showing us here as he shows us through the story is that there is a contrast between the experience, and it's a very real experience. The contrast between that and the bigger picture reality. And believers, I'm going to say this is you too. When you are overwhelmed, when you are scared, when you are in danger, when you are worried, when you are wondering where this is all going and how this could be good, I want you to understand that experience is very real. Your emotions as a human being are very real. Your perspective is very real. But it's not the whole story. It's not even the main part of the story. There is a much bigger picture. And it is a much bigger picture that you can only engage by faith. Not by sight, not by understanding. It's why my life verse, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your understanding. It's why that is so important. Because my understanding will say, this is all there is. What I get, what I see, that's all there is. But what God invites us to is that there is more than we see. And so the parents here, their experience is danger. Their baby's in danger. They feel pressure. They feel tension to hide him every day. And humanly speaking, the power dynamic was very clear. There were powerful people who were using their power to abuse and even kill the powerless. There is nothing that demonstrates that more than someone killing a baby, right? I mean, there are all kinds of power dynamics in society, but a baby is undeniably helpless. And so if someone were to kill a baby, that is just such a clear dynamic, and that's what's happening here. Helpless babies, the power dynamic is clear. The experience that mom and dad had was there's no reason for long-term hope. All we're hoping is that we make it through the day. Their hopes were really low. They were struggling to find small hope. We just hope he doesn't get caught today. We just hope he doesn't get killed today. And there's a real chance that tomorrow could be very much worse than today. If you've walked this path, this is what Moses' parents are living. And that, when you walk that path, that has spiritual implications too. For the people of God, trials ask us, what do we believe about the one that we worship? Because God, where are you? You said that you would watch over us and that we asked you for protection. Why have you let this become so dangerous? Why don't you do something? And I would say Moses' parents raised those questions regularly. God, we are your people. Why are you allowing these heathens who don't even worship you to oppress us and to kill us and to make us slaves? You said you chose us to be your people, that you loved us. Where are you? If you've ever been in that moment, I want you to take the lesson that Moses is inviting us to take from here. Because at the same time, all those questions are real. There are clues that this isn't the full picture. Let me just point out one of them. Pharaoh has already twice tried to eliminate baby boys from the Hebrew race. Both times, this powerful man has been thwarted by nobodies, by just regular moms and midwives who just said, no, we're not going to do that. And here we have a family that is the living, breathing example of that. Pharaoh says it's the law that when you have a baby, you're supposed to kill it. And they said, no, we're going to hide it instead. There's already clues that what Pharaoh says is not the whole story, that there's another narrative playing. And I would say to you right now, if you're wondering, where are you, God? Look for the other narratives. Because a lot of times God will give us clues that he is at work in the midst of our question. He is already at work for a long-term good we can't see, we don't get, we don't understand, and he's using smaller things. Our eyes are on the bigger things, but he's using smaller things, powerless things. And that is to prove that God is greater, that his plans succeed even in the face of all the power that a human being can bring. And so the story continues. She can hide him no longer. She's reached the limits of her ability to hide the baby safely. But she doesn't give up, so she takes what is readily available. She makes a papyrus basket and makes it waterproof with tar and with pitch. And she says, I'm going to try to save my son. She takes him down to the Nile River. She puts him in the Nile River as she has been commanded to do. But she changes it enough by putting him in a basket in the Nile River so that by putting him in the Nile River, she's not in trouble, but he's not dead. It is possible, many people believe, that this was more than just a one-time thing. That after 3 months, the baby Moses was taken to the Nile River and placed among the reeds day by day. It's probably why Miriam is watching, because at nighttime, everybody's going to sleep. It's probably safe to bring the baby home. And then in the day, you bring him back to the river and you leave him there to hide him in the river. She does what Pharaoh commands, and her hope is, here's her highest hope. Please let my baby survive. Please don't let my baby be killed. But what I want you to see, and I hope you get this, God uses that hope, that small hope, to do so much more than that. Not because she deserves it, but because God is a God who does more than we could ask or imagine. So some of you are like, God, could you please just, I promise I'll never ask for anything. You're just real, like God is just like begrudgingly giving you goodnesses. And we start to express it as though God isn't good like we've said he's good. Like he isn't for us. Like he's not faithful to us, like we've said we believe he is. We start to live and act and breathe like we've got to twist God's arm a little, or we got to make a deal with him. There's got to be something in it for God in order for him to do something good for us. Does anybody here believe that about God? No. We got saved by grace through faith. It is not from ourselves. There is nothing righteous in us. There is nothing good in us. It is the work of God as a reflection of the character of God. And And because of that, we have this foundation. We're going through it on Wednesday nights as we look at Ephesians 2. There is this foundation for our life that God is reliably good and better than we could come up with in our heads. And the way to live that out is this. When we're asking God for a little, recognize God is not just going to give us a little. And I'm not saying like you're like, oh man, God, I'm really struggling with money and I don't have the money to pay my bills. Give me a little money and God's going to give you a lot of money. I'm not saying that. Because money is just this. God's not concerned about our financial status in that way. Like that represents his goodness. God is concerned about eternal good. Big picture, ages good. Not just short-term good. And so God's going to do more than she asks for. Lord, please watch over my baby. Please protect my baby. Please let him live today. God's not just going to save this baby. God's going to use this baby to save a nation. Not even on their radar. They're not like, Lord, here's Moses. He seems like a good kid. Could you save Israel with him? They're like, please don't let him die. And God's like, watch what I'm going to do. Your prayers, although well-intended, are way too small for what I am going to do through this small, vulnerable, weak baby. And have you ever thought, you could probably come up with tons of examples. I'll give you a few. Have you ever thought about how many times in the Bible, how many times in the stories of the Bible, do we find God using what is intentionally too small or too weak or too meaningless? How many times does God intentionally pick something that isn't big enough for what he's about to do, and then he does it anyway? Why is that over and over again in the Bible? Maybe it's so that when we look at our life and we're like, we don't have enough, this isn't enough, it's not going to be enough, God's like, now you remember all those stories I gave you, right? Think about it. We got Joseph, the forefathers of the story here. Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, who becomes a slave and is powerless and weak. And that narrative bends its whole arc towards redemption, that God will use the one who has no power and no voice and no right and no family and use him to save the whole nation. Right? Moses, later on in the story, God says, I want to save the nation. What's in your hand? And Moses says, a stick. And God says, good, we'll use that. Whoa, what? A stick? He's like, yeah, throw it on the ground. And then later on, they're at the Red Sea, and God says, hold your staff up over the waters. A stick. Now, was that a really magical stick? Was it a real precious stick? It grew from a special plant somewhere? No, it was a stick he picked up somewhere along the way and said, this looks like a good stick. And God says, we'll use that. There's a shepherd boy who fights a giant. And the point is, he's way too small, way too young, way too weak, way too inexperienced. And so, of course, he wins. Why? Because I come to you in the name of the Lord. Not because of me, but because of him. Christians, we need to lift our eyes to a bigger picture of God. Later on, there's a famine in the land, and the prophet Elijah goes to a widow and says, make me a cake, make me some bread. And she says, I only have enough for one. He says, make me one. So she does. There's a little bit of oil and a little bit of flour. And when she's done, she still has more. So she makes more. And then the next day, there's still more. And the next day, there's still more. And the point was, there wasn't enough, but God made it enough. Again and again and again. There are, in the New Testament, 5,000 people sitting on a hillside, and they need lunch. And Jesus says, what do we got? And they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And the point is, it's laughably not enough. And so God says, good, we'll use that. So in your life, there is a reason you look around and go, what I have is not enough. This isn't going to work. Nothing's going to happen good from this. Everything looks dark and bad. It's because when the plan of God plays out in your life, it's supposed to be a testimony to the glory of God. And yet we go, God, would you just take this trouble away? Would you just take this trouble away? Please, please, please make it better, make it better, make it better. God's like, I've got much bigger plans than just making it better. Will you trust me? Will you trust me? Because what I'm going to do, you haven't even conceived of yet. I have deliberately taken what is too small. I have deliberately selected what doesn't have enough so that you can see it is my power supplying it. And so here at the beginning of Moses' story, we see a baby who will become the one who redeems all of Israel. And in a few months, we're going to celebrate another baby who came with a lot of parallels to this, helpless and weak and homeless. They're born in a barn. Under the threat of death, the King Herod wants to kill all the babies again. Weak and vulnerable. And yet, he is the Savior of the world, the one who provides a way for all who believe to receive eternal life. It's almost as though back here in the beginning, God is teaching his people how to recognize a Savior. Don't look for the powerful, don't look for the king, don't look for the strong, don't look for the tall. Look for the weak. Look for the one you can write off. That's the one I'm going to use because it's going to be my power in them. Even in this story, God shows his ability to save. So the story goes on, verse 5. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son, and she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." God saves this baby. And God puts him on a path that was unimaginable to a mom who was putting her baby in the water. Worst case scenario, can you imagine his mom going down to the river or his sister going down to the river with the baby in the basket, putting the basket? What's the worst thing that could happen today? Someone finds him. An Egyptian finds him. And that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't just an Egyptian. It was Pharaoh's daughter. And this scenario can you imagine the worry that mom had about an Egyptian finding my son in the river? Day in, day out, the focus of her prayers had to be, God, please make him invisible. Make it so that they can't see him. Make it so that they can't hear him. Please, God. And God's like, no, I want them to hear him. Because that's how I'm going to save him. Do you see how small we are in comparison to how big God is? Our solutions, it is always amazing to me how tempted we are, and I say we by including me. We are to tell God what we think the solution is. Like God is up in heaven going, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do. And we're like, God, I've got a suggestion for you. Ooh, I got a good idea. And God's like, what? Please tell me something. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Like, I'm not saying it's bad for us to tell God what we want, but I'm saying we should do it with the humility to recognize that God's plan is so far beyond what we could come up with. Some of the things right now that you are so afraid of, that when God brings them to pass will be your deliverance instead of your destruction. And you will be amazed at what God does. Instead of living in fear of that now, how about if we live in faith? Saying, God, no matter what comes tomorrow, you've got it. You are bigger than anything that will come, whether I see it coming or not. The response is not what she feared. Instead, it is this compassion and this desire to help. How many of us have spent so much time, so much energy, so much of our well-being on worry, focusing on the possibilities of what could come that was bad? But then we project all this bad, and most of it never comes. Have you ever experienced that? You worried and you worried and you worried, and the bad that you were worried about didn't come. What do you do with that? What should you do with that? Because here's the deal. You just surrendered your well-being, the focus of your mind, your time to something that didn't happen. Yeah, but it could have. And next time, maybe it will. And so I've got to constantly be on alert. I've got to constantly worry about it. When you start to realize that God is faithful and true, and that what he will do can take even the thing you're worried about and use it for good, then you start to live with peace instead of this constant tension of worry. If God is who he says he is, if he is great and all-powerful and mighty, and he can do anything, and he has promised that he will do good for you, can you trust him? So do the work. Humble yourself. Let your fears and your cares be cast on the Lord and leave them with him. Because our God is a God of power. Our God is a God of miracles. And our God is a God who loves you. The very crying that they were trying to hide, that should have been the cause of danger, is now the cause of great opportunity. Please don't let him cry. No, I want him to cry. Moses' sister hears some of the discussion about her brother and her crying and comes to volunteer to find a Hebrew woman, like she was going to go searching, right? She ran straight home. His crying now brings him home safely. Mom wasn't asking, please let him come home. She was asking, please let him live. But now, God, through crying, through the discovery, through the worst case scenario, brings him home. And on top of that, just because God's showing off, the family is going to get paid for caring for their baby. When I look at this, I wonder how the enemy has had such inroads into us to take us away from being people of faith that endures, that holds on, that is strong, and how we all come in weary and heavy and overwhelmed. It's because we had the hope sucked out of us. We've stopped believing that God is bigger and better and greater and trustworthy, and we've started believing that our life is collapsing in on us and nothing is ever going to be good. And when these bad things happen, it's the end of everything. Whose narrative is that? It's not this, right? I pray that we can be people who take this lesson to heart. The rest of his life, Moses is named for this event. I drew him out of the water. You think he heard this story a few times as he was being raised by his mom? That God saved him and that God did more than just save him? It started to plant a seed in this man. That God saved him, and God does more than we could ask or imagine. And he starts to believe that God maybe saved him to do more than he could imagine. Eventually, Moses is not just saved and raised. He goes back to Pharaoh's house and is trained in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. One of the reasons we have the first 5 books of the Bible is that part right there. That he's not just a slave going out and working every day. He's a young man who is trained in education so he can write. And so eventually, he's the one who writes Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy because of this event. And here we are, 3,500 years later, reading what Moses wrote because God does more than we could imagine. God does more than we pray for. God works on a bigger picture than we can get our head around. He does good. He does impossible good when we trust him. So people of God, you've heard the promises before. We know that God works all things together for good. I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. I will never forsake you. I will never leave you. Our God is mighty to save. We know these promises. We know these words. But I wonder how long it has been since the power of those words surprised us and invited us to a deeper faith, to believe in a bigger salvation and a bigger plan that God has for us than that we have for ourselves. Right now, in the life of every person who believes, God is working out a saving and a hope that is far beyond anything that's ever entered your mind. Now that's hope. And if you know in your soul that that's true, maybe the storms this week have made it hard to hold, but if you know in your soul that what I just said is true, that God is working out a saving and a hope that is far beyond what has ever entered your mind, then that changes everything about this day, everything about this week, because hope changes everything. Let us be people who have a hope in a God who deserves our hope, who invites our hope, and then shows us why we are not foolish to hope. Let us put our trust in him.